Um, it has always been the case in the 20 years that I've been involved in this that economic development has been the single most cited reason for communities and others to think about developing networks or partnering for them. And over the years, we've found that economic development means many different things to many people and has different dimensions. And so in our track on economic development and job creation and broadband, we look at that issue from multiple angles, and we try to make progress in each of our sessions with finding solutions that you can take home with you and put to use right away. We've also created a tradition at our economic development summits and regional conferences, and that is to open our sessions with this blue ribbon panel, a very dynamic and experienced panel led by Lev Gonick. You probably just saw him introduced in the session next door or yesterday. I'll just say that Lev is a superstar in our world, involved in helping form the U.S. Broadband Coalition and U.S. Ignite and GigU. He's the head of OneCommunity that is revitalizing Northeast Ohio, and he's a former CIO of Case Western Reserve. And Lev, please lead this panel.
Thanks, Jim, and I'm most proud of just being friend of Jim, as probably is the case for many of you. And certainly a number of our panelists have long and very proud relationships with Jim Baller over the many years. So as Jim indicated, this is very much an ongoing dialogue. For the first almost 4 years now, we've spent much of the time making the case for why ultra high-speed broadband network infrastructure is relevant to economic development, and then how relevant it is. And now, as we realize the continuing maturity of the deployments of next-generation networks across the country, that while there are still many who would ask us why it's relevant and how it's relevant, we're going to try to keep moving the conversation forward to the next level of conversation, although, as has been our tradition, we welcome your feedback, and you can take us back to any of those earlier questions, why and how much. Today we want to really start focusing in on the impact of private-public partnerships, which in the last year and a half or two has really begun to transform the dialogue around economic development. And again, I really want to open the conversation by asking each of the panelists to just briefly describe from their vantage point and from their personal as well as organizational vantage point, what does the notion of a private and public partnership mean for the prospect of actually contributing to economic development and to having impact in the communities in which they operate? So let me just kind of go right down the line here. I'll also let each of our panelists briefly introduce themselves in that context of answering the first question. Only to mention that Sandeep is not Doug at the end, but Sandeep will introduce himself as well. Please, go right ahead, Chris.
Thank you. I'm Chris Mitchell with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in Minneapolis, and my microphone is not on. I'm Chris Mitchell, now with a working microphone. With the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in Minneapolis. I focused mostly on local government policy. For a long time, that was really focused on municipal networks and what local governments could do to build their own networks. And now that it's more broadly accepted that that is a successful strategy, or it at the very least can be a successful strategy, we've broadened our vision a little bit. And in particular, we're very interested in cooperative approaches in more rural areas and what we can do to structure public-private partnerships in a way that will benefit the community for a very long time. I run muninetworks.org, and we have a newsletter that I always forget to tell people about that you can sign up for in the upper right of that if you just don't get enough of me right here. I really like the way this panel is framed in the write-up for it in terms of recognizing that neither the public nor the private can do this alone. And it's something that I've long believed. We saw that in the electrical sector, where private companies began investing, and cities did not always find that they were getting the results that they needed. And so cities very early on began building their own networks. There was a lot of conflict that I think perhaps was not necessary in terms of the private sector trying to stop the municipals from doing that. But then ultimately we found that it wasn't enough to just do public and private companies, but we needed rural cooperatives to make sure that every last farm had access. I think we're going to see the same thing with internet connectivity. And when it comes down to it, the public sector cannot act without the private sector. It's very much a situation in which even when a public network is being built, such as Lafayette or Chattanooga, which are common ones people are familiar with, they use private consultants, they source from private companies, there's all kinds of private benefits. It's definitely an arrangement that benefits everyone. And so I think I want to just note that, and I want to stop.
Right.
Apparently.
That's great. We've been there before. This is how it's worked before, and it can work again in the internet, next generation broadband network. Nicole Turner-Lee.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm gonna pull my mic back because I'm from New York and by way of DC, and I'm probably very loud. So I'll pull it back. Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee, I'm Vice President and Chief Research and Policy Officer for the Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council. I'm not sure if the last time I was here we had a different name, but it's the same acronym, MMTC. And I'm really excited about participating on this panel, particularly because of the work that we do at MMTC. We're a 29-year-old media advocacy organization whose focus has been on advancing ownership for people of color and vulnerable populations. And we have a particular focus on closing the digital divide. So the work that we've done has primarily embraced and undergirded any type of vulnerability that exists among communities, and how do you drive inclusiveness. I'm no stranger to this movement. I have roots back to group called One Economy Corporation, and for some of you, I am not that old. I was part of the Community Technology Center movement back in the late 80s, 90s, where Texas was one of our first stops with the Telecommunications Infrastructure Fund back in the days when we were trying to do broadband infrastructure. I just want to echo what we've heard so far, and I'll keep it brief because I can talk, around broadband access and public and private partnerships. I think for those of us at MMTC and those of us that do social advocacy work, we've seen public-private partnerships evolve from nonprofit industry, government, nonprofit industry, nonprofit government, and I think now we're seeing what's called like a trifold effect, where we're seeing nonprofit community-based organizations partnering with government, partnering with industry. And the particular reason why that's been so critical and important is because it's about scale and replicability. We are finding more and more and more that we have great cases and examples where we've actually been able to, in my particular work, drive the social dividend and the economic dividend of having broadband access, but we cannot do it alone. And so I think a lot of this discussion that we'll have today is around how do you leverage those best practices where you actually get the best of the practice and where you also assess what might not be working so well, right? And I think a lot of the discussion of what we've seen over the years is where there have been very effective models of these compounded interests among all these stakeholders, and where there's been some conversation about where we could get better. And so I'll leave it there, but our particular focus is on leveraging those partnerships primarily to drive the digital inclusion side. And I'm really excited about it because I think we're going to talk about all these exciting things that are happening in the Beltway in particular that are beginning to frame models around those types of partnerships.
Thanks, Nicole.
You mean something's really happening in the Beltway?
It is. It is. Believe it, and it's not just election stuff.
That's not real at all. Raleigh Cole.
Yes, I'm Raleigh Cole. I'm here because I've spent a lifetime doing reading and writing and agitating in the area of economic development. I was also very involved in the computer user group movement. So when we finally had a technology with a really explicit relationship with economic development, I achieved what Hugh Forrest talked about, convergence, in my own lifetime. And I'll just start with my one-liners on Jim Baller, as one would expect from a lawyer, carefully called this public and private working together, not necessarily a partnership. And I would say, as my first two sound bites, that's important because there is never any successful major public or private undertaking without public and private collaboration. Imagine large boats in a small harbor. They have to work around or with each other or they will fail. So everything is a collaboration, whether it's explicitly a partnership or not. And as we'll get into some detail, and none of these arrangements, no matter how explicit and how signed and attested and notarized, are what a beginning law student would consider a partnership. And we can go into what I mean by that later.
Great, thank you. Sandeep.
Hello. So, sorry, Doug Kinkoff going to be here today. He's my boss. So he heads OTIA, the Office of Telecommunications and Information Applications, which ran the BTOP initiative for the last 7 years, and now we've evolved into Broadband USA. So I think he'll be here probably within the next few hours. His flight was delayed, so he asked me to speak. And a few days ago, I guess when Lev gave out the questions, Doug had me write the questions. I thought, okay,
Write
Doug,
the answers.
write the answers. And I asked Doug a few hours ago, well, why don't you send me the updated version? He was like, you have it. So anyway, I'll speak off of what I wrote a few days ago. Again, I'm speaking from the perspective of a federal agency that ran mostly on the infrastructure side a middle mile program to really serve as a catalyst to the deployment of last mile solutions. We did a few last mile projects, but mostly middle mile. And all of our projects involved some sort of a PPP arrangement. But more than a PPP, they involved all sorts of business models. Our lead entities were commercial carriers, state and local governments, nonprofits, co-ops, and R&D networks. Behind that, I look at the full business model. Well, what is the relationship to the ISP? What was their marketing strategy? What was their partnership strategy? What was the geographic span? What was their technology network design? And if you take those six frameworks and apply it to our 110 middle mile grantees, we literally have hundreds and hundreds of permutations. And I have a personal interest, as well as an organizational interest, in looking now at those middle mile business models and seeing which ones have been most successful. And I define success, but not just in terms of execution, who got their networks done on time, within budget, and achieved the scope, but which of these middle mile projects is serving as the greatest catalyst to last mile, and which ones are sustainable, both financially, and which ones are really expanding beyond their original scope. So either building more middle mile and or last mile. And of course, the last big factor that I look at is which ones are promoting socioeconomic development in the most aggressive cases. And so to me, PPP is definitely a relevant term when we look back at the effectiveness of our program, but it's more than just the PPP model, it's the business model. Again, we have, and we've talked more about this, but some of our grantees, you look at the relationship that they had to the ISPs. Some were owned by the ISPs, some kept it as a transactional relationship. In terms of services, some are lit services only, some are dark fiber pure plays, some are combos. In terms of customer ownership, some are just going to be specific, or only going to be carriers, and others are vertically integrated. In terms of their partnership strategy, again, every grantee had an assortment of private and public players behind them. Some were investors, others are basically operating partners.
Sandeep, I'm going to stop you there, take a breath, and that's a really nice framing to suggest that there are lots of combinations and permutations based on real life experiences of hundreds and hundreds of grant recipients during the stimulus era. Well, if you're listening, at least like I've been listening to the first go-round, you'd probably sort of say, well, this is going to be like kumbaya, like they're all saying this is private and public partnerships or public and private folks working together. I mean, if it's so obvious in 2016, like, what is the issue? And one way to frame what the issue is is that in fact these are sort of soft responses. These are easy responses. Of course, you have to have big boats and small boats in the harbor of Raleigh. I mean, you know, they have to actually be sort of working in some kind of choreography, but that's really kind of just an overly simplified challenge that we have to be thinking about, because fundamentally, in the public space, we think about public benefit, and in the private space, we think about private gain. So, if we're talking about public benefit and private gain, is there a trade-off as we're thinking about actually the deployment and the adoption and the use of networks between public benefit and private gain? Or is all of the economic theory that we've been studying and working on and creating policy around for the last several hundred years basically a moot point, because in 2016 all we want to do is like get along together? So why don't you go ahead, Chris, and sort of start us off, because I don't think you have a point of view of that on that one.
Well, in many ways, I think public versus private is the wrong framing. There's two other ones that we come at it, large versus small. And in this case, I would say Google's a very large company that acts like a small company in this space with the strategies. The other is absentee owned versus locally owned. And that very much changes the way that economic development can happen on the ground. Because when you have a distant company, they may look at local businesses as just another customer, whereas a local business or a municipality that's rooted in the community looks at that as the lifeblood. It's the future of the community. They're going to do everything they can to help a new entrant or an existing business expand, or a new entrant come in. And I'll wrap up, because I'm going to try and be tighter now. I love moderators that remind us that our job is to converse and not just shout. There was an article in the New York Times about Mount Vernon, Washington, that has this great fiber network. It's open access. They have like 9 or 10 providers that serve local businesses in the community. Several businesses have moved from Seattle up into Mount Vernon, which is 60, 70 miles north, I want to say, in Skagit. And one of the businesses said, look, it's not just a matter of getting faster connectivity at lower prices. It's that if something goes wrong, I walk out of my office, I walk down the street, and I talk to the guy who's running it, and we fix the problem. And I think that that's a really important thing that's not necessarily captured in public versus private.
Yeah, it's a good point. But Nicole, I'm going to come back to private versus public, because that's what the moderator can do for now, and I'll let you take over if you want to go down the same route as Chris did. But you do have a history. You've been out on the street making the case for the inclusion and inclusivity agenda, and if it were simply a matter of sort of saying, well, we just need to get to a common hymn note, it'd be a whole lot easier. But there really are differences between public benefit that you pursue and private gain, and we haven't always found a way to get there. So what's your reflection on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and again, having experience working, I mean, where Jim and I first met was when municipal broadband was being launched across the country, and we sat across the table from each other in the city of Chicago, looking at whether or not that was going to be a feasible option in terms of going into that direction. I think what I've learned over the years is this whole concept of, again, going back to this tension between private gain and publicly beneficial outcomes, accountability, and the longevity of commitment, right? Because at the end of the day, you begin with this idea and aspiration of having a connected city, but where the rubber hits the road is when you begin to look about accountability structures, when you begin to look at public input, when you begin to look at, who funds it, how does it sustain that longevity of funding? Is it something, no disrespect to the BTOP projects, but even in the rollout of that, there was a lot of conversation about sustainability. To what extent is it community controlled, where they actually have the assets and the resources to take that further? To what extent does the community understand what they're getting into? Going back to Chris's point about large versus small, I think one of the exercises that happens in these types of partnerships is this constant assessment, because of what you're talking about, the private gain. So this aspirational noodle, which is, I want to go in and we want to provide infrastructure and bandwidth to people, while at the same time you turn around and you have a product and you realize that the low-income people that you're offering it to don't want it the way that you want to give it to them. So then you go back to the drawing board, and that's where I think we fail, is we don't go back to the drawing board and say, okay, where is the accountability? Once we've actually serviced the community, I used to work for a group called OneCommunity Corporation. We were also victims of that, right? We'd come in and bring all these great resources to the community, and once the funding dried up, we were out, right? So part of it is like, what happens where you can actually turn over that control to the community, or as we're starting to see with some programs like Comcast Internet Essentials and others, where they're beginning to develop these deep ties within communities, where there's some level of stakeholder engagement, where the community, where the program can actually live beyond the partnership.
So Nicole, it seems to me like that's a statement that kind of helps us to reset expectations. We're actually very early on in trying to get these sustainability models going. And one of the interlocutors that we've had over the years in this conversation has been our friends in Urbana-Champaign at UC2B. And you want to, those of you who know that model of that community's experience, they are right now, at this very moment, very much in the throes of the challenge of trying to actually maintain that original commitment that came through the original funding to actually be engaged not only with the community at large, but in particular the community that sits on the other side of the track, quote unquote, and running up against the realities of what happens in the private marketplace, which is not only that one private investor's come in, but now that private investor is being acquired by a second private investor, and some of the communities kind of going, well, what's going on here, and what about us? So again, that's not always have to be in that sharp relief in terms of what's going on, but I think you raise a...
Oh yeah, and I just want to say, just on that, we also have to be very careful about the assumptions that we make about community, right? I mean, I spend most of my days looking at the Pew data and other data, sort of telling this realistic story of how people want the provision of broadband service. So even in recent, and I think I have a panel on this tomorrow, but even in recent conversations about various reforms happening in DC, sometimes it's really not designed for the people we're trying to serve. And so we turn into this other thing about the presumptions of the private sector, government trying to cookie cut a model that at the end of the day, you have to have, I think more communities looked at the longevity of solution as opposed to what are we doing right now. We actually might see a lot more sustainability around these projects.
Yeah, were it so. I mean, I just want to make it, were it so. Raleigh, I took a cheap shot. Come right back.
I've got a micro rant on anti-kumbaya. There's a book well known in my training called Governing New York City, but it has a wonderful throwaway line that business and government are exactly alike in all the unimportant respects. And so it's like, for me, it's like fingernails on the blackboard when they talk about government ought to be more like business, or we really ought to have social benefit corporations that consider all the balanced interests of all the stakeholders. You know, that's like making Peyton Manning try to be a running back. You know, you've got one of the world's best pure passers who runs like someone once said, a Venetian blind falling down a hill. So I think these things work best when you don't try to make the leopard changes spots. You take the advantage of the market-oriented private organizations and the public benefited government ones and figure out how to make that work, recognizing they are different.
Raleigh wins. Yeah, Raleigh wins. Wow. All right.
Sandeep, I mean, again, we're trying to make it a little bit of a harder edge on this one. When you do take a look back through the collection of projects, and in fact, I'm going to invite, I think, on anticipating your answer, going to Chris, in the idea that middle mile really does provide opportunities to accelerate last mile strategies by some combination of the permutations that you were referring to. Is that happening in enough of the places? Is that a jury still out? Or in fact, is the jury back and maybe it's not quite as rosy as I might be thinking?
Well, it'll never happen fast enough for what we had hoped, right? We, again, funded nonprofit entities, public entities, R&E networks, and private entities, and the hope had been that they'd be a strong catalyst for last mile investment. Now, when we look at the mobile wireless in all of these markets, they were mostly 2G, 3G at the time of BTOP. Most of them have gone to 4G. A lot of that 4G migration has been enabled by the BTOP middle mile. So that's been a great success story for both the communities themselves, but also for our grantees. Our grantees are, many of them are doing terrifically financially because of the backhaul revenue that they've been able to achieve from the 4G networks. So they've been the real anchor clients over a lot of our grantees. And so that's been a great story. And then they can take those 4G profits for backhaul and reinvest it in more middle mile and last mile. So that's been a great story. As far as the actual last mile build-outs, no, it's been, I would say, slower than we had hoped. Now, we're only about 2 years in, so I think there is some element of the jury is still out. But if you look at many of the communities that we built these middle mile networks in, these are very difficult communities in terms of the economics. They're, low density rural markets where the demographics may suggest low adoption rates. So that's one factor, but then there's a number of other factors. A number of these markets that we passed, they're rate of return regulated FCC markets, and many of the, according to my grantees, what they tell me is some of the incumbents have been waiting upon the FCC to release its CAF rules for that. So now that those rules were released, the 400-page order was just released Thursday, you will see some action for those grantees that were on the sidelines. But we're seeing some, we are seeing great stories out there. So, at the highest level, you look at the states that have been supporting our grantees in terms of helping them build out last mile. Massachusetts, as I mentioned yesterday, gave raised $40 million to 44 communities to build last mile. That would be, the $40 million would be a subsidy investment, which would constitute 1/3 of the ultimate capital build. So the towns would have to raise 2/3 of the capital. Leverett, Massachusetts was the first town to move ahead. A number of other towns have authorized to issue bonds to build last mile. Now, within those 44, my understanding is from MBI, 10 to 15 towns are just going to be stuck because these are really small towns where the adoption rates may be really low, and these are towns that may not have the ability to raise any capital. So they're looking for either a private investment to couple with the state's investment, and they may have to look at a fixed wireless solution just because the wireline economics may not work.
Sandeep, I'm going to stop you there because that's an good example of actually public and public partnerships trying to move things forward, which is one part of the story. My sense is, Chris, that you may not even buy the assumption that the middle mile investments are actually going to lead to private capital or maybe even additional public capital coming in to actually drive that last mile, which was the assumption, as you just finished saying, Sandeep, of the whole undertaking.
Well, that is my concern. And I would preface this by saying this is not a criticism of BTOP, which I think was well administered and had a variety of goals that it had to achieve. I think it did those things well and we're reaping many benefits. The question in my mind is we have a new administration that's going to come to town. And the question is, where are we going to spend the next few $1 billion? Last mile or middle mile? And my concern with focused on middle mile is that middle mile does not change the capital challenge of the last mile build. A middle mile network will help you by making a business case more sustainable because you can afford your transit better. That changes the operating cost. But the barrier to building these networks tends to be capital cost. When you build the last mile networks, you create a business case for more middle mile networks, which is the kind of dynamic that we want to achieve. And so I'm a strong proponent of focusing more on last mile. I think that the danger of focus on middle mile is you can actually even reduce the business case for last mile because middle mile can come in and connect the anchor institutions, the businesses that can pay for it, the high margin customers that would make a last mile business model cash flow. So there's some danger there as we're figuring out where to put the next $1 billion. And I have to say that I know that the folks at NTIA work in a variety of communities that have different experiences. And we've heard there's a debate among all sectors of investing in internet networks. But the experience that I've seen in a number of these rural high quality networks, when you give people in rural areas a reasonable price at a high quality internet access, they really buy it in high numbers. I mean, we were trying to figure out some numbers around this, and we're seeing like in RS Fiber in Minnesota, you had over 50% of people that have committed to buying it in the areas, and it's even higher. I want to say like 75% in the areas that have no options today. The over 50% is when you mix in the people that have some poor options already. When you look at a number of the rural co-ops that have been building out electric co-ops, they're seeing take rates well over 50% because these are people that really want it and they just don't have a good option. If you're going to try and figure out what take rates are by comparing it to slow DSL and poor cable that's overpriced, I don't think that's a relevant comparison.
Okay, Chris, so I don't want to lose the point, and I want to give Sandeep a chance to come back at it, not because I want the debate to be between the two of you, but I mean, I think what I want the audience to hear clearly is that it may well be that the next challenge in front of us is the last mile challenge, and the question for the panel today is, can private capital actually get off the sidelines
to continue to use the Peyton Manning framing here, and actually come into play because of either the precedent of the literally billions of dollars that were invested through the middle mile efforts, or is the problem actually about the same, or maybe, I heard you say, even exacerbated? So Sandeep, first to you, and then let's come back through Raleigh and Nicole.
You want private capital to pull a Brett Favre, not a Peyton Manning. You want it to come back.
Okay, I'll have to work with that one. Sorry, Sandeep, though,
Okay.
first to you.
Manning's return
Sure.
was way more successful than Favre's.
Let's step
Take
back.
it offline. Take it offline. There's a bar for that. Go right ahead.
Right. So there's two ways. I guess there's two factors in dynamics, or the dynamic here is what was the policy ambition of BTOP back in 2009, and at the micro level, how have the networks done as far as promoting being a catalyst for last mile? So back in 2009, let me just take you back to 2009. We were coming off.
But briefly.
Okay, briefly. We were coming off one of the worst economic recessions, and it was really a stimulus program. And so we were back in April of 2009, all of us got around the table, and we asked you all for a lot of feedback on what we should do with the $4 billion as far as the infrastructure program. There were some folks who came in and said, let's just deploy to these unserved areas 3G. Make all of these unserved rural towns go on 3G or fund 3G, and game over. Imagine if we had done that. And we actually did a few wireless projects like that, and I can't say the outcomes are terrifically positive. Most of that equipment would have been obsolete today. We would have funded EVDO back then, or WiMAX. And so I'm glad we didn't do that. We also didn't want to interfere with all of the dynamics that would be happening at each individual town. I mean, these towns varied in terms of their quality of service, in terms of just the business case, in terms of what overbuild could or couldn't be the case. So we wanted to take the $3.5 billion in the end what we had for infrastructure. I think in the end it was much less, and scale it to as many communities as possible and give them the potential to do last mile. So from a policy perspective, I think we did the right thing by focusing on middle mile. Now, if you look back at a micro level, what is happening community by community, this issue of that we've challenged the competitive landscape for a new entrant because our grantee is controlling some of the anchor revenue. I've heard that argument. I think there may be some truth to that. But then I also I talk to some more BTOP grantees, and they'll say the community institutions haven't really been the anchors. You don't really make that much money off the library. You don't make that much profit. If anything, the libraries are loss leaders. You don't make much money off the schools. And if there's a university in town or a healthcare center, yeah, there's some good revenue there or some profit. But it really has the community institutions, the CAI, community anchor institution. I would say the A probably hasn't been as big of a sustainability factor as some other drivers.
Sandeep, I'm going to stop you there. Right after this panel, there's a whole panel really talking about this very topic at length. What I hear you saying is, vis-a-vis Chris's assertion, is that, again, it's probably more of a mixed story going forward. I'll let you guys debate that one perhaps offline as well. But let me invite Raleigh and Nicole to comment more generally about how do we think about the opportunity to bring capital into play for last mile now that we are not likely to be seeing a whole lot of any middle mile public subsidy coming forward. Can there be private public strategies for bringing last mile dollars into play, which is really where the conversation needs to be right
First, I'm going to stick in another micro rant. Sandeep, I'm not blaming him, use the word catalyst. Infrastructure, pure infrastructure is almost never a catalyst, as in you add it, something immediately happens. It's an enabler. To use another analogy, it's fuel, not the match. So it creates the conditions, if you build it, it's not that he will come. If you build it, he is able to come if you invite him. So it always needs something else on top of it in the best of circumstances.
Do you have a micro rant on the prospect of last mile that you want to get in here while we're micro ranting?
Yes, I mean, I'm mixed.
Not on Sandeep and Chris's conversation per se, but I mean, the challenge really is, you know, we're no longer talking about whether the middle mile was a good strategy or not. It's done.
No,
As this country-
I have news.
Oh, you
I
have news. Okay.
I went to, before the big, fancy, everyone goes, South by Southwest Interactive, I went to the little sister South by Southwest EDU. And at South by Southwest EDU, they announced the formalization of a partnership between the College Board and the totally revamped, Come to Jesus, Confess All Your Past Sins, Do Better in the Future version of the College Board, and Salman Khan's efforts, heavily sponsored by Microsoft and all that. The College Board is taken by 1/3 of all seniors in the U.S. You cannot do the test prep between the PSAT in the 9th grade and the SAT in senior year without robust broadband. So we now have a spark. There is now a reason for every high school kid in America to have broadband in the home to work on for better on the College Board, and it will
And
affect
more,
at
right,
a
Nicole?
minimum 1/3 of all high school seniors in the U.S.
Okay, Nicole.
Yeah, and I mean, I was going to say with regards to the last mile conversation, the public policy goals that we're talking about are the most critical reason why we should be focusing still on the last mile. Many of us in this room have talked about the last mile for more than 15, 20 years, about the last mile not being covered. And I'd like to change the analogy from football to basketball and talk about what happened last night. You didn't think that Villanova was going to win, but if you give them the ball, they actually shot it and they took the game, last night. That's the same thing that we might actually see in terms of the capital gains that happen in communities that you're discussing. We're already seeing it happen. I mean, what we have historically seen is communities that do not have access to broadband infrastructure find ways to do that, right? We've seen broadband over power lines. We've seen other examples where communities have been empowered to create their own collectives to actually do this. The challenge is, again, it's the assessment of this risk factor that we talked about. How do you do it in a way that's sustainable? How do you actually provide some competitiveness in the marketplace? Whereas when I meet people who are actually there's only one local provider, the folks that Chris is talking about, they're still paying $80, $90 just to get access. So we've got to figure out a way how to adjust the marketplace where we can get last mile access, increase the risk factor, or make the probability for the private sector to invest much more attractive, even if it means that they can't see the bottom line. I mean, we've argued this for a really long time, folks, with regards to the private sector saying, well, I'm not going that far into the trenches. But at the same token, we're seeing business models and we're seeing public policy goals that if we don't get to the last mile, we're essentially replicating the type of disparities that we've been trying to solve.
So, Nicole, I want to come back with a tougher question for you, but I want to put the audience on notice that after that, we're going to open it up so we have a good 10 minutes of exchange with you along the way. Nicole, you made, please come up to the microphone if you've got a comment or a question. Nicole, you made a comment earlier on about the importance of looking at a Comcast-like solution around the Lifeline product set of kind of beginning to engage with the community. Do you have concerns about the fact that whether you're in an urban setting like your community or my community where that's good enough, or you're in rural America where the now standard guidelines are no longer 25 down, but 10 is good enough, that we're actually not only creating two kinds of America, those that have broadband and those that have really got broadband, and in fact that the gap could actually not only not decrease, the gap could actually grow as a result? Or is it time to just be pragmatic and say, listen, let's just take this and see if we can create better value than we're currently getting? How do you approach that?
I think, and I'll kind of educate folks who haven't followed this Lifeline discussion. I think that's a great example of this type of competition that we're trying to get into the marketplace, right? I mean, the Lifeline order that just passed wasn't just about replicating the same old way that the program was done, keeping the same old policies, keeping the same old providers. It was really about opening up the marketplace so that people that were in the Lifeline marketplace could actually get other services, right? And it was also about depressing the price point or maximizing the benefit so that you could actually include broadband in a useful manner that made it what we thought was going to happen, a bipartisan embrace by both sides of the aisle. It didn't happen. But I agree with you. I mean, I think part of the conversation today when we look at broadband, much like Lifeline, is we're not trying to create a bifurcated internet. This is not an internet of the haves and have-nots. The type of robust access that people need to get to educational videos, to get a job. I was just on the plane looking at a Twitter feed. Pew just put out a study that said most Americans, and we kind of already knew this, but more and more Americans are heavily reliant upon the internet to find a job. Those people are the people that many of our cities and states are trying to serve through other programs. If they don't have access,
Right.
and if they don't have reasonable and feasible access, that's a problem. At MMTC, we fought that. There was a conversation about giving people who are already poor a mandatory or voluntary copay to get broadband access. Who would think, like my kids would say, huh? You know, what is that about? We're talking about people that all of us in this room, at this conference, want to find ways to bridge the infrastructure challenge and bridge the digital divide challenge to create social and economic dividend.
Okay.
But you're so right. We can't do that by actually parsing out what works. But I also want to say just real quickly
Sure.
on the Compass example, just real quickly,
Moderators
I do-
losing control.
I
Go
know,
ahead.
no. I just want to say real quickly. I do give companies like Comcast, other companies that have tried to do low-income broadband solutions, some credit for coming into the marketplace and, again, taking the risk. It was like that guy that took the shot at the last 30 seconds last night for Villanova. I'm going to take the shot.
4.7 seconds.
Oh, 4.7 seconds. Okay, I wasn't paying attention, but I was pretty happy. Sorry.
That's when it was inbounded. The
But-
shot was taken at 0.4 seconds.
For 4 seconds. See, I
With
can't
four-
win
Oh,
up
that's true.
here. Right?
I should never argue with the
Right.
sports photographers.
But my point is, right, the key thing is that he took the shot, right? And I think part of this conversation is about taking the shot
Right.
to see. And that is the same call
Right.
that needs to be given to the private sector.
Right.
It's the same call that needs to be given to government.
Yeah.
And it's the same call that needs to be given to nonprofits. It is
Yeah.
not mutually exclusive.
Right. Okay, we're ready for the first question or comment. I just want to reflect as Susan. Go right ahead. Go right. No, I was going to just say as you were getting to the microphone, but go right ahead.
Thank you so much. So, is this on?
Yeah.
It just the level will come up as you speak, I think.
Okay, sounds good. So right now, some of the offerings that are out there that the private sector has put out there, whether it's through Connect Home, through things that have been in place for a couple years now, like Internet Essentials, as you have alluded to, you kind of stole my question, but that's okay. You had great remarks. They don't really meet the standard that we know needs to be met for people to have like truly meaningful, robust access to the internet. It seems that we sometimes aren't really, not even shooting for the moon. We're not even going for what I'm assuming most of us subscribe to when we're asking the private sector to set some standards and put some things out there. How do we get past that?
Good. Go right ahead. Chris, you want to start? I think Sandeep, I'm going to invite you to also reflect on the question. I do want to just share that the last time we had a dialogue, this was the topic. We spent the whole panel on this issue of inclusion, not because we shouldn't have whole conferences on this, and there are, but even at this gathering. But I did then and I do now worry about unequal growth in the deployment of last mile solutions where we're placating the rural communities and the urban centers, and actually probably marking them for a much more difficult future 10 years from now, because this may be the last dollar invested in those communities for at least 10 years.
Right, I think that's the danger, is that we're not letting people achieve their true potential if we're just giving them a slow connection to the internet that's hobbled, particularly in the upstream direction. I think, there are good people who work at Comcast that really want to use their power to improve the world. There's true of any major corporation. There's also people at Comcast who think in terms of what you might call a realpolitik, I believe is the old expression. And they look at it and they say, well, there's a possibility that programs to try and improve internet access among those who don't have it will result in more competition, and that will hurt our market share. So therefore, we should develop programs that will provide something without risking eating into our market share, that we can provide at a very low cost, perhaps even a profit, and get away with that and get a whole bunch of benefits, including mergers and things like that as a result. So I think it's dangerous to put this on the cable companies, even if they want to try and solve themselves. It's too big a problem for them to solve. We don't ask General Mills to feed the world, to solve the problems of hunger, and we're smart not to.
From a public policy perspective, however, Sandeep, where does the public policy piece of this come in to make sure that in fact we don't have a country, if you don't allow me here, Chris, that isn't actually starving because General Mills doesn't think it's worth putting food on any shelves in those neighborhoods. I mean, what do we do public policy-wise to make sure, and is this approach that we've seen adequate? Is it heading on the right trajectory? I thought I caught somewhat of a nod when I was making my case for unequal growth. Or do you think that we should simply say, at least we've got the private sector engaged in trying to help work with public policy folks and the public sector to solve these problems? What's the politically correct thing to, no, I'm sorry.
Well, that's a very philosophical question and sort of framing of all of these topics. And I mean, I'll just give you sort of my hat. I come from the world of corporate strategy, so I helped build business cases for the large carriers for many years. You know, my clients were Comcast, Sprint, AT&T, and so I think my personal and my professional positions are intertwined on this point that the private we need the private sector to invest, but they will. I mean, I'm not saying anything new here, right? They will invest if the ROI is justified, and oftentimes the ROI is a lot greater than their cost of capital. You know, these cost of capitals will run anywhere from 9 to 12%. Yet when I was working for the carriers, and my friends tell me it's still true, we would evaluate projects based on a 18 to 22% rate of return because there were many other competing projects that would be funded if that you did not achieve that margin. And so that is the reality. That's the reality. And so the payback has to be obviously very aggressive to achieve those kinds of rates of return. So, you know, from a policy perspective, I think it's important that there are, and I'm glad to see at least more sources of financing. For example, when McCarty Capital folks talk about Kentucky and how the investors are looking at 5.5% as their threshold to do that $300 million deal. That's a beautiful thing. And I think low-cost financing with longer-term paybacks will be very revolutionary to helping last-mile deployments happen. But going back to, I guess, the philosophical discussion, I mean, I'm trying to intertwine that with what we did at BTOP. And again, I want to emphasize that, and I said this yesterday, it wasn't, we didn't invest in middle mile and it was build it and they come. We knew that it would require a great deal of planning by each community individually or collectively. It would require, in some cases, public subsidy or creative forms of private financing and PPPs and various kinds of PPP arrangements along with state and local leadership. So it requires all of the above, and we're seeing it, again, not at the pace that I had hoped, but I think, I mean, I'm not really sure how to answer the...
It's okay, Sandeep. We're going to let another question come in, and it'll come to you as well, I'm sure.
Hey, guys. My name is Oliver Pilko. I'm from Access Infrastructure Partners. We're actually a new investment fund, so we're actually a private investor that's looking to place capital into this area. We've been looking into it for about 6 years, and we come from the wireless telecom infrastructure side, building cell towers, cell sites, and all that fun stuff. My question to you would be is where should we start looking to deploy capital today? You know, we feel like rural is going to be a hard first step to take. And we also think there's solutions in there with the co-ops already in place. And I think they have access to very beneficial capital as it is today through the government. Us as a private player, we obviously want to make a return, but we also have a long span in the way we structure our product over a 20 to 30 year window. Where would you say would be our ideal spot to kick off and kind of start placing
Before
capital?
they answer, and before you get mugged, because everyone wants to talk to you, do you have a publicly announced rate of return that you have to hit over that 20 to 30 year period of time? Is it at the 5.5% institutional capital, Macquarie, Sci-Fi, or is it at the venture 22, 25+% of the venture capital side, or somewhere in between?
I would say somewhere in between. The way we did our structures and the cell tower side was we used diversified portfolios. So we think that obviously the first few deals have to make sense, but as we expand our portfolio, then your returns in theory level out. And you see it on a portfolio basis on the securities market, and we've replicated that in the past as well.
Good answer. Why don't you chime in, because this is an invitation. I think you'll get a lot of people saying, whatever they said, forget it. I'm your customer, but go right ahead.
Well, I have quick bit of advice that is that there appears from my insights, there's sort of an optimum density, and that optimum density is not found in big cities. Those are too dense and not found out in farmland. But in fact, in smaller towns,
What
many of whom
is
are
a
not
smaller
part of
town? Is it under 50,000? Is that a,
well,
let's be as specific as we
sort
can
of
be
depends
here.
on the town, but I would.
Well, density isn't specifically about the town. Is it? I mean, is it about 50,000? Is it 30,000?
Well, I've been more impressed at the 8 to 10.
8 to
pick
10.
off all
Okay,
the
well,
little ones.
all right, because then there are people here. Who
So,
represent
but
those
anyway,
communities.
think Sandy, Oregon, or the little towns in Idaho, or the little towns in the mid South that are exploring broadband on their own, but are also sometimes whatever the name of the town in Maryland is.
Westminster, I was told that many times.
Yeah, okay,
Right.
but it's a town in a rural area, but the town is not part of one of these bigger co-ops. It's its own entity, and it strikes me that that's kind of the easy mark. You get there fast, they'll love you, and they'll do all sorts of things.
Nicole, is there a way to get our kind of cities engaged in response to this gentleman's question? Or?
Yeah, I was actually thinking of when you talked about that, and you and I are probably thinking the same thing. So I always get like this conversation when people talk about urban, about, it's all this connectivity in urban areas and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, but there's no Starbucks in the hood. So I don't know where you're talking about, right? And I would say, like, for new companies, there are these, like, and we try to tell minority owners all the time that get into this space, there's these opportunities to create dense networks to leverage, your capacities to actually build out what we all struggle with in urban areas, in particular, the anchor institution to the home. And so there are these pockets where we actually have minimal bandwidth capacity, just generally because it's not seen as an economic development driver in some of these cities. And that becomes sort of a blockage even for some of the public policy goals that need to be implemented, where we're trying to create this continuous experience between what, DC is approving in terms of schools and what people are, quote unquote, getting or not getting in their home. Companies like yours, I tell folks all the time, when you look at telemedicine and telehealth initiatives.
Yeah, Nicole, can I just jump in to share that really in the city of Cleveland, 45% of the people who live in the city of Cleveland have no fixed internet service. They are in the backyard of the Cleveland Clinic.
Yeah.
And Cleveland Clinic can't afford the model anymore of having to come through the front door.
Yeah.
So we need some solution set, which has got to provide some return on the investment piece of it. And it won't work long-term, certainly won't work. And I don't even mean long-term. I'd say in 3 years it won't work based on the asymmetric solution for Lifeline. It won't work that way. Anyway, Chris, quickly to you.
Yeah, I would briefly say that a lesson that comes to mind is a small ISP in Minneapolis that's expanding into a suburb with use of public fiber. And I asked them, what led to their decision to do that? And they said, we asked the city. The city came back to us very quickly with a response, a rate card, and a simple process. There are hundreds of cities that have fiber. Most of them is not deep, but they have fiber. They have the ability to create more. And I would look for that. And I would say, we're looking for cities to make it easy on us, because there are certainly cities that are figuring out how to make that happen. And the more of you there are, the more the cities will figure out ways of doing that to be able to help you boost your investment.
Sandeep, I imagine these are exactly the kind of questions you love to have.
Right. Yeah, let me answer that one. First of all, focus on many of the BTOP communities that we passed, so I can come back next year and use you guys as an example of a last mile build down and get less help from Chris. No, I would say focus on the BTOP middle mile cities, or look at them, and then have a framework. After that, I would look at where the incumbent providers have decided not to take advantage of that cheap middle mile. I mean, the middle mile that we funded, are the networks themselves aren't just local middle mile rings. They oftentimes, we allowed the grantee to build a long haul network to a major city center like Boston, where the IP transit rates are very cheap. So the wholesale economics are very, very attractive for any last mile provider. So again, I would focus on BTOP communities where the incumbent is not moving, where the state or local government is willing to maybe provide a subsidy and maybe commit to some demand aggregation to at least have some more anchor revenue for you guys. I would look at towns that are where you have community champions and other leaders in the towns are mobilizing, and there's many of these. I mean,
Right.
or the last 4 days, every time I come here, you see all these community leaders who want folks like you to come in, provide the private capital to build a private-led, publicly supported model publicly facilitated, as Joanne Hovis was saying yesterday, and so they're out there. And
Sandeep, I know you've been really generous with your time offering insights, and so oftentimes it's from the other side. That's community folks who are kind of going to Sandeep. Who do we turn to? Maybe after you guys can set up a tent in the bar, and you'll have a lot of conversation.
Right.
But I do want to invite additional folks. We've got about another 5 minutes structured here for other comments or questions from other folks in the audience. This is usually best when you guys are jumping in and offering insights. I'll repeat the question if you're too comfortable in your seat.
While they're waiting.
Sure, please, right ahead.
Another micro rant, where I think the term digital divide for the purpose of social and economic development is mislabeled.
Okay.
It's a very important concept, but it should be the digital gap, because that's a gap in coverage that creates both a market opportunity and a social opportunity. There are all kinds of things you can do, like online test prep, if you can be confident that a huge fraction is not going to be left out. There's a whole bunch of new applications that will become economically viable if the market gets expanded the last 15, 20, 30%, whatever it is. And the divide, it is an important concept that we need to bring these people in for their good and for kind of the good of the world. But it's also true we need to bring these people in for our good, for the good of the suppliers, for economies of scale, for being able to do social programs the faster, better, cheaper way, because they're universally available. So I hope we also say digital gap as well as digital divide.
Can I jump in real quick, just real quick to clarify before we go into the...
Yeah, and I do want to get our audience...
Just real quick. So I actually believe, I do agree. I sat in something yesterday at the AEI Foundation, which is the Markle Foundation. Zoe Bard, who's leading the Digital Economy Board of Advisors for NTIA, talked a little bit about this digital gap and the skills gap. But I want to really be unapologetic about the fact that a digital divide does exist. And the digital divide are still what Pew actually published in July of 2015, the 15% of Americans that are the poorest, the oldest, and the most remotely situated folks, who in many respects mirror the other America of Michael Harrington back in the 60s, where they are people that not only don't live in a place where there's access, but they also live in places where there's access, but they don't know how to leverage those assets simply because they are the fringe of our American society. So I would just take the analogy of the gap, but never obliterate the concept of the divide, because as long as we see disparities, it's still going to be there.
Please.
I'm sorry, I just had to say that.
What the reaction of the panel is about the impact of the CAF2 funding on other public-private partnerships in what will now be barely served areas?
So reactions to the CAP2 piece, and you're welcome to jump in if you want to, but you may also want to hold your fire on that one. But anyway, reactions. I'm just going to start, Chris, briefly with you. I think you may have an opinion on this.
Yeah, if you ever want someone to just speak rapidly without thinking, turn to me. It seems to be my role. I think one of the biggest dangers with CAF2 is that we are certainly seeing this, and I know that this is happening in Minnesota, where some carriers are literally saying to states, don't spend that money on expanding high-quality broadband because we're getting free money from the feds to bring you low quality. But we're really going to be delivering higher quality than is demanded of us, but also don't set standards that would require us to deliver that higher quality because we can't actually. There's so many sides of their mouth. I think it's almost like a spherical gap in their mouth that they're speaking out of. It's just. And so
is that can we tweet that? Is that all right?
I don't know how you get that down to 140 characters, but the real danger is
an emoji of some sort or other.
I think it's very hard to reform those programs in a time-appropriate manner, given how fast things are going. But right now, there is a real danger of not getting high-quality internet access out to places because there's a promise that maybe in the next 6 years there will be a low-quality option delivered. And I think we cannot listen to those sorts of arguments.
Folks, we're near the very end of our time. I just want to try to summarize by saying that unlike the last 10 or 12 years, the discourse, the conversation, and the dialogue around private-public partnership is no longer being framed in binary terms.
Right.
That represents, indeed, a maturing of the dialogue and the conversation. And while the jury is absolutely still out, and I very much like the way Sandeep framed essentially the matrix of the different ways in which we can be looking to see where it's working and how it's working in terms of the absolute ultimate trade-offs between public benefit and private gain, between growth and opportunity, growth for the private sector, opportunity for the public sector. These are things where we need to remain sharply focused when we think about the work that we do in our communities as a whole, as an industry. If we're not talking about it, then we're actually going to find ourselves simply consuming what comes out of the PR departments, which typically is more candy-coated than is probably good for the health of our communities and the country as a whole. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a really good conversation.